Thank you, Don, and thank you also, Joe, for the invitation to be here again this year. And I'm glad the swimming is taking off. It'll even have a French flavour to it tomorrow. I'm delighted to be back in Glenties for what for many is an annual pilgrimage in terms of political interest, and this year is no different. I want to welcome the DUP and Sinn Féin colleagues here, and also, of course, the Leader of the Opposition in the Dáil, Micheál Martin. It has been of considerable advantage to the Irish government, and indeed I would say to the Irish people, to have a strong degree of cross-party consensus in the Dáil on the vital issues linked to Brexit. We've had some differences of opinion, that's clear, and that's politics. But by and large, in the Oireachtas, there's a healthy recognition that Brexit is an issue of such import for our island that petty point scoring pales into triviality. When you contrast that with what we've seen in Westminster, where fighting within parties is rampant, never mind across the aisle, we can agree that the Irish people are relatively well served, I think. Well served in terms of that consensus approach. As the title of this session suggests, we simply cannot countenance a return to the borders of the past. It's a determination that the sweat and tears of a peace process of more than 30 years in the making won't be sacrificed by the most extreme Brexiteer ambitions. It's a belief that as much as possible of what has been made in terms of the relationship between our islands, so positive today, needs to be maintained and nurtured and protected through this process. The unique and profoundly peaceful ideas around the deep and interlocking relationships on these islands as brought to life in the Good Friday Agreement encapsulates perfectly the sensitive equilibrium which has served us so well for the last 2 decades and which we in government and I believe in opposition are determined to protect. I am a product of Anglo-Irish relations. My mother for most of her life held a British passport. My brother is married to somebody who holds a British passport today. My uncle and my aunt are the most English people I know. As I've said before, I think one of them voted for Brexit. The one who I don't discuss Brexit with right now. I studied and I worked in Britain. In fact, the university that I was part of in Britain has as its president Prince Charles, who recently I had the pleasure to invite and to welcome to Cork. As I said, I am a product of the Anglo-Irish relationship, and so I suspect are many other people in this room. And I know that for me, and indeed for the Taoiseach, whose parents lived in Britain for much of their lives and whose sister lives there now, there simply isn't anything remotely anti-British in the positions we are taking to protect peace, and both the spirit and the realities of the partnerships that are in place now between our two countries. Naturally enough, there has been some anxiety at recent Brexit developments. But as MacGill is an annual affair, it's worth taking stock of what has been accomplished or agreed since you met here last year. This time 12 months ago. Most people were telling us that the Irish issues would have to wait until the UK had left the Union before they could be solved. We could only look at the border when we got down to the nuts and bolts of that future trade or association agreement. That's what we were being told. There was no meat on the bones, on the loose promise of not returning to the past. And where are we now? Firstly, compared to a year ago, there is an even greater understanding across the European Union of why the Irish issues matter so much and why they are at the forefront of the Brexit debate now internationally. An outstanding solidarity illustrated by visits to the border by prime ministers and EU ministers from partners like Austria, Finland, Belgium, France, Sweden, and many others. I saw it on display again in Brussels last Friday, from Michel Barnier himself, as always, and by my counterparts from almost every other member state. Their message is clear. If Ireland is unhappy, we're unhappy. The Irish border is the EU's border, and we're together on this. And that is how these negotiations will progress. Secondly, the British government has pledged internationally in the December agreement with the EU that the guarantee of no hard border is the overarching requirement in terms of future arrangements. It has agreed again in December that this will be achieved, if no other solution is agreed, by full alignment with the relevant rules of the single market and customs union, in order to protect North-South cooperation, the all-island economy, and of course, the Good Friday Agreement. And then in March, the Prime Minister herself committed in writing to Donald Tusk that this will take the form of a legally operable text for a backstop as part of the withdrawal agreement. And that backstop would be there unless and until something else replaces it by agreement in the future. And so we already have clear agreements in terms of how we protect what is important to Ireland in the context of the peace process and, of course, the border question. We know how in principle it's going to be dealt with. What we don't have is agreement on a legally operable text to get us there just yet. But I believe over the summer months that can be done and will be done. And maybe I can take some questions on that later. That is good progress, significant even. But to some degree, the Irish issue at least did fail to progress at the pace that we thought it would post-March. We hoped that by the June summit, we would have an Irish backstop and the text for it taking shape. And that didn't happen. The UK has turned its focus instead to the future relationship and how it envisages its customs and regulatory relationships with the European Union after it leaves the EU. What is notable about this phase, which we had hoped would have concluded by Chequers, is that it has primarily involved the UK negotiating with itself, as opposed to negotiating with the EU. Not negotiating with Brussels or Michel Barnier and the task force that he leads. The UK's real interlocutors in this process was their own people. But instead of trying to find compromise positions between ministers who prioritise the real benefits of a close economic and security relationship with the EU, and ministers, and indeed backbenchers too, who take a more ideological approach, where leaving the EU seems to be an end in itself, as opposed to a different type of future. On this issue of the future relationship, the Irish government has been consistent. Some would say somewhat boring. And that position has been clear for well over a year now. We believe the best guarantee of prosperity in Britain's future is to remain as part of a single market and a customs union shared with the EU in the future, or at least arrangements similar to that effect. The title of this session suggests that that ship has sailed. But all who cherish the relationship between our islands should continue to aspire to that deepest and closest of relationships if we are to limit the damage of Brexit, which is what we're trying to do. This is quite obviously the best solution in terms of retaining an open and invisible border on our island. But look at the likely impact on the UK economy too, because that matters for Ireland. The Department for Exiting the EU in London, in its own analysis, puts the gap between a soft EEA-style Brexit and a harder free trade agreement Brexit as a gap in value terms of £60 million per year to the UK economy, £60 billion per year to the UK economy, and a difference between a 2% fall in GDP and a 5% fall in GDP. That's huge, and is the difference between what are often presented as two quite benign scenarios. Ireland needs a good outcome here. A strong British economy is good for Ireland. An economy that's trading and open is good for Ireland. We have a €70 billion a year trade relationship. 40,000 Irish companies, or 38,000 to be exact, trade with Britain every single month, most of them every single week. That's 200,000 people employed in those companies, 10% of our workforce. And the figure is far higher when you look at the secondary connections in terms of Irish commerce with the British economy. So when we say we want the closest possible future relationship between Ireland and Britain and the EU and Britain, we mean it. We mean it because that's good for Ireland, but it's also good for Britain. Because by and large, what's good for Britain, economically certainly, is also good for us. So then, what is achievable between now and the European Council in October? My understanding is that the debate that you had earlier was somewhat challenging, but also somewhat pessimistic. And my job is never to be a pessimist. It's to try to be optimistic and realistic at the same time. And that should be the focus for negotiators now. Well, let's get a framework for the closest possible future relationship between the EU and the UK, considering the ideas in the British Cabinet's white paper and guided by what will deliver the most trade, most investment, most jobs, while preserving the integrity, of course, of the EU's single market and customs union, which the EU negotiating team will not compromise on. There's no way they will ask existing member states who aren't going anywhere to actually have to sacrifice a functioning and integrity of the single market that they rely on in order to accommodate a country leaving the European Union. That would be an unreasonable ask, and that is the key principled approach that the EU brings to this. And as an absolute priority, the EU needs to see our backstop or our insurance mechanism in the Ireland/Northern Ireland Protocol nailed down to ensure that no matter what, as British Prime Minister May pledged again last Friday in Belfast, there will be no going back to any physical infrastructure at the border. And I believe while her speech was greeted with some negativity by some, I think there was a lot of positives in that speech, particularly in terms of her firm recommitment in terms of no border infrastructure on the island of Ireland, her firm rejection of technology as a way of solving that problem, and her confirmation again that actually those that say, well, we're not going to put up a border on the island of Ireland, so if the EU wants to do it in the future, that'll be their problem. She faced down that kind of nonsense talk and said, Britain is the country leaving the European Union. We have an obligation to our neighbours to be part of finding a solution here that fulfills the commitments that we've made. But of course, we need a partner in the European Union with which to agree that. And so while there was an emphasis on that speech, which I think some people may have been somewhat frustrated by, the commitments that have been made by the British Prime Minister and her government in the past in relation to the border were repeated again. So it is essential too, as Michel Barnier has stated, that we de-dramatise the backstop or the protocol. I think that's a lovely French translation. I'm sure there's a French word to describe that. But when Michel Barnier comes to Northern Ireland or to Ireland, he's really strong on this point. We need to stop ratcheting up the political language in relation to the Irish backstop and start talking about the technical requirements that can allow it to work. Because when you start breaking it up into different areas that require certain checks in certain areas and so on, it does start to make more sense. And indeed, I think that is what needs to be the focus now of negotiators. For one thing, we should put to bed the notion that there are any constitutional implications or any constitutional agenda at play here. There simply isn't, at least for the government anyway. The only way in which Northern Ireland's constitutional status can be altered is through the principle of consent and through a vote to change that status by the majority of people in Northern Ireland, and indeed in the rest of the island too. We are rock solid behind that absolute principle, and I am on the record as saying that calls for a border poll in Ireland are both unhelpful and unwise in the context of what we are trying to disentangle and negotiate in the context of Brexit. It is a distraction that we don't need, that fires up disagreement and concern and anxiety. And we could do without that in the context of the challenges that we currently face. But at the same time, the argument that Northern Ireland can't be treated any differently from any other part of the UK needs to be challenged too. Aside from the unique architecture for Northern Ireland in the Good Friday Agreement, which is guaranteed by both governments, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have different rules and regulations from England, and from each other too. That's the result of devolution and the diversity in each of those countries. To use some simple examples, councils in Northern Ireland have very different powers to councils in England. That represents divergence. The planning system is different in Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom. A range of diverse issues, from animal health to regulation of locks and waterways, are governed today on an all-island basis rather than an all-of-UK basis. As we know very well, on certain social or progressive issues, Northern Ireland takes quite a distinct approach from the rest of the United Kingdom, and indeed a different approach from the rest of Ireland. None of this makes unionists in Northern Ireland less British, or the union with the United Kingdom any less strong. None of this has constitutional implications, and the linkage to constitutional change has made bringing technical solutions to a political problem even more difficult. So let's be practical as we move forward and try to keep the rhetoric at least reasonably measured and give ourselves the best possible chance of an agreement by the end of October. If the UK doesn't like the text already on the table for the protocol, it is welcome to put forward a language of its own, as long as it meets its own commitments of December and March and the guarantees of the avoidance that they have given in the context of any physical border infrastructure in the future. And as I've said previously, once it comes to negotiating the detail of the future relationship during a transition or implementation period, Ireland will be a strong voice in the EU in terms of advocating for the closest possible partnership, which in our view is in Britain's best interest. However, even a comprehensive free trade agreement will mean some changes. And the government had some significant announcements to make on preparedness and contingency last week. But our preparations need to be about more than contingency planning, or indeed the significant range of business supports that we've already announced. Getting this island Brexit ready has to also be about restoring a Northern Ireland executive and assembly so that Northern Ireland can make decisions for itself. It is worrying for any elected representative to sit on their hands and to let dangerous vacuums develop. And in my view, that is what is happening in Northern Ireland right now. I know it is not an easy thing to re-establish an executive. But assuming that the status quo will simply be okay until the context changes and provides an opportunity for that re-establishment is a dangerous strategy in the context of the pressures that many communities face in Northern Ireland today. On Wednesday this week, I'll be in London with our Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, to meet with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Karen Bradley, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office, David Liddington, for what will be the first British-Irish intergovernmental conference since 2007. It is sensible to get this institution of the Good Friday Agreement back up and running and to use the opportunity to intensify our work as co-guarantors of that agreement. But to put it simply, the magnitude of the issues which have caused the Executive and Assembly to collapse pale in significance in comparison to the magnitude of the challenges ahead. So it is incumbent on all parties to reach practical agreements on the small number of issues where there is still a misunderstanding or indeed disagreement, and then to move on to tackle the bigger issues posed by Brexit in particular and the multitude of other pressing concerns as part of a power-sharing executive. Standing proud in defiance is not to stand particularly tall these days. Whether that stand is being taken in London, in Belfast, in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, or anywhere else. Better, in my view, to summon the spirit that achieved the Good Friday Agreement against the odds and against expectations. The goodwill that brought Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness to the steps of Stormont, and the long-term vision that that hero of the Northwest and this island, John Hume, was all about. I had the pleasure of meeting his family in Derry earlier today. With real leadership north and south and east-west, Ireland and Northern Ireland can emerge, in my view, from the first years of Brexit with continued prosperity, peace, and partnership. It is a prize worth all of our energies in the months ahead. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your detailed questions.